that are acting at the request of the superintendent, whether it involves board members or not, it is more likely that it is not a body that needs to comply with the Brown Act at all. So if the superintendent picks 2 board members with whom he would like to check in on a matter of board business and never asks the board which 2 he should talk to, probably, well, I can say with a great deal of confidence, the Brown Act doesn't apply to that meeting for a couple of different reasons. We're going to talk about a technical concern in just a moment. But if the board wants something done and takes action to make it happen, more likely that the Brown Act applies to that body. If the superintendent is simply meeting with people in advance of a matter to be brought to the board, less likely that the Brown Act applies to that body.
It's also safe to say if it's board action to create a committee to do some business, it's under the Brown Act and all the technical things about the Brown Act. If it's put together by the superintendent for advice
Correct.
regarding the school, then it's not under the Brown Act, or it does not necessarily have to be under the Brown Act, and not subject to the technical constraints of the Brown Act. Okay.
Correct, exactly. Okay, so moving on to topic 2, what is a meeting? This is a meeting. That's kind of the easy part. But under the Brown Act, a meeting is any congregation of a majority of the members of a legislative body at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate on any matter within its jurisdiction. Thankfully, with a 5-member board, it's easy. A majority is 3. So anytime 3 of you are anywhere, whether it's in this room or not, and you hear, discuss, or deliberate on any matter within your jurisdiction, it is a meeting under the Brown Act. That includes lunches, social gatherings, study sessions such as this, or board retreats. Doesn't matter what you name it, it will still be a meeting under the Brown Act, wherever it occurs. There are exceptions. There are exceptions for conferences open to the general public that involve issues of interest to the body, other public meetings, meetings of other bodies under the same local agency, or social or ceremonial occasions, as long as a majority of the members do not discuss application of specific issues to the legislative body. So let me unpack that for you. If you attend a meeting of the Daly City City Council, even if all 5 of you are there, it is not a violation of the Brown Act. If 3 of you at that meeting gather in a corner and start discussing the impact of that city council action on your school district, it becomes a meeting. So it's okay for you all to be together if you are all hearing what everybody is hearing and everybody can hear what you are saying. But you may not break out into a group and start to discuss the significance of it to the school board.
Once again, it's okay to hear what everybody else is hearing. So say, for example, there's one person there, one person there, one person there, one person there. They're all hearing everything that's coming out.
If you are one of the 4 things that I just listed.
Yeah.
So a conference open to the general public, another public meeting, a meeting of another body of the same local agency, or a social or ceremonial occasion. It would not be okay for you to hold a meeting in one of your houses and invite the public without posting an actual agenda and technically complying and saying, we're just here to listen. So the we're just here to listen does not get you much in the way of freedom, except if it's one of those 4 things. So it has to be open to the public and fit into one of those 4 categories.
So if it's open to the public, say, I have it in Ceremony Mall, it's open to the public, people are discussing, it's regarding, general information about curriculum, and all 5 of us just happen to be there. We're not discussing, we're not sitting in the same area. Is that a violation or not a violation? Because it's in a public place.
The Brown Act uses the term conference, and I would prefer to have more facts that make it a conference. If 3 of you bumped into each other at Serramonte Mall and started to talk about curriculum, that would not be okay, even though it's in a public place, and even if you spoke very loudly and let other people hear. Because the point is essentially...
Hey, what do you think about that?
Exactly. From all the way across the mall. The essential point of the Brown Act is that you have an opportunity to talk to each other. It's here. It's in these meetings. So if you have something really vital to talk about, the best way to address it is to post an agenda, tell the public you're going to be together, and then get together. And these other things are limited exceptions to account for the fact that the Brown Act wasn't designed to mean that you couldn't go to the CSBA conference. Okay, you can go to the CSBA conference. You just can't all sit at the same table and talk about your district. Because then that would be a violation.
So-
You should sit at other tables with other school board members and interact with each other and learn about the issues affecting those other districts. If you want to talk to each other, you have an opportunity to do that. It's here and now.
Say,
Are at the same table, we need to talk about our spouses and our kids, not the school district's business.
Correct.
so I guess what I'm wondering is that, say, for example, there was pertinent information coming out, like fictitiously, they're talking about school district curriculum, they're talking about it at ceremony. I actually want to hear about it because might as well hear it from
Right.
our superintendent or our assistant superintendents, and we're all located in different places. We're not going to talk, we're not going
Yeah.
to do anything. We could actually listen.
That's fine.
That's not a violation of the Brown Act, because one, we're not conferencing, one, we're actually not running into each other, and we're just, listen, I just want to hear it
That's right.
comment. So that is not a violation of
That's
Brown
not a violation. Please don't sit together, but it's
Yep.
not a violation.
Act.
Now, let me talk about probably the most complicated issue we're going to talk about tonight, which is the concept of a serial meeting. The longer you've been in public office, the more confident you will become about the rules about serial meetings. So when I told you that the Brown Act, when it was originally enacted, was a commandment, hold your meetings in public, and a prohibition, don't hold your meetings in private, that was originally the way it was, because the idea was city councils would meet in smoke-filled rooms and make all their decisions behind closed doors, and the public would only find out about it later. Well, the minute that got prohibited, all the elected officials for local agencies in California got smart and said, okay, we won't have the smoke-filled room, we'll simply call each other. So the Brown Act had to be amended to prohibit that as well. So a serial meeting can take one of two forms. One is a chain communication. Person A calls person B, and then person B calls person C. And some fact about a collective concurrence is shared amongst those three people in the course of that communication. So I won't pick out names because that could be uncomfortable. Board member A says, I am never going to vote for that initiative, and I want to see it killed as soon as possible. Calls board member B and says, I'm just never going to vote for it. I don't care what changes are made to it. It's dead on arrival as far as I'm concerned. Perfectly fine, perfectly legal. Two board members implicated. But if person B then calls person C and says, you need to know that person A is intending to vote the project down and is not going to allow it to be approved, it becomes a chain communication. And that's illegal because it effectively allows boards to hold meetings entirely in private outside of public view, just through the artifice of not technically being in the same room at the same time. But, as I said, person A and person B have not themselves violated the Brown Act because you're allowed to talk to one of your colleagues. On a 7-member board, you're allowed to talk to 2 of your colleagues. But on a 5-member board, the most you can talk to is 1. If it expands to 3 people, that's when you reach the realm of a Brown Act violation. So, this is a little counterintuitive, but this is my advice to you. If you have a matter of board business where you feel you need to do some politicking with your fellow board members in advance, do not talk to the person who you know is already on your side. Do not. Talk to the person whose mind you believe you need to change, because then you're done. You won't be able to talk to a third person. If you talk to the person you know will agree with you to strategize, it will then become illegal for you to talk to the second person. The second kind of violation is called a hub communication, where it's one person talking to 2 people, which happens fairly frequently and can be a problem, where one person says, I'm going to vote this down, and then that person says, well, I don't care, I'm going to vote for it, and that person says, well, I'm done with you, and calls another person and says, sees that they can get that person on their side as well. That's a violation of the Brown Act. That behind the closed doors politicking is a violation of the Brown Act. And it's a serial meeting, and that's why it's prohibited. But again, the essential element is when it's being done in order to create a concurrence as to action taken. So you can have multiple conversations with multiple board members offline without violating the Brown Act at all, if they're on different topics, okay? So you need to be very strategic about never talking about the same topic with two different board members in an online, in an offline kind of way. You can choose the person you talk to about topic A, and you can choose the person that you talk to about topic B, but you can't switch midstream, because even if those conversations are separated by months or potentially even years, you've created an argument that you're trying to develop a collective concurrence as to some kind of action. And let me give an example about an area where this can result in some difficulty. When it comes to the December organizational meeting of the board, when there is a difficult decision to be made about board offices, about who's going to be board president and who's going to be vice president and who's going to be clerk and all of that stuff, there's a desire to avoid ugliness, there is a desire to broker compromise, there is a desire to be wise in government and not air dirty laundry or be seen like you're horse trading or doing any of that kind of stuff. So the temptation is strongest in the 4 or 5 days of December leading up to that meeting to call two of your colleagues and say, I will support you for board president if you support me for vice president, or I'll be clerk this year if you tell me I can be president next year, or whatever it is that happens to be said. Even though it's on a simple matter of board governance, it's still not a legal way to conduct board business. So you can't have those conversations with more than one board member at a time. You can call one and say, will you vote for me for president? Because I'll vote for you for clerk, or whatever the case may be. One, but not two, because that would be a chain communication. And this is a matter as to which there has been some public activity in San Mateo County where a city council member had that exact problem and thought that it was simply a matter of easing the board's difficult business of selecting who was going to be mayor or president of the city council. I can't even remember what the name of the office was. Made some calls. Those calls got reported to the district attorney, and the district attorney wound up writing a letter saying, you violated the Brown Act, you could be prosecuted, don't do it again. So I've never had a problem with my clients doing this, and I believe it's an easy rule to follow if you know that it exists. So please, no serial meetings or chain communications. Now, special problem about email. The Brown Act was written in the early 60s. Nobody anticipated that we would have the system that we have today. Probably it was understood when chain communications were first prohibited that you shouldn't be able to write a letter or a note to a fellow board member and then have that letter or note be passed to all 5 board members in advance of the meeting. Nobody expected that you could just hit forward and, in the world of email, make it to all 5 board members at the same time. I would ask that if you do receive an email from the superintendent that makes a recommendation or reports some matter of district business to you, that if you wish to correspond, be very careful which button you press. Press reply. Do not press reply all. Reply all is a trap for the unwary. If it's accidental, I believe there's unlikely to be found an intentional violation of the Brown Act. But reply all, or hitting forward and saying, can you believe what that board member said to me? One of my colleagues is going to vote no on this item, or whatever the case may be. If you forward that, it's a chain communication, and it's implicated 3 people. Person makes their statement, you receive it, so far so good, it's only 2 people implicated, you click forward and send it to a 3rd board member, and all of a sudden there's now a paper trail that shows that there's a chain communication. So ask that that be avoided. Now, a special problem for bulletin boards and chat rooms and Facebook and social media. I believe there will need eventually to be legislation in Sacramento solving the problem of the fact that it is technically a violation of the Brown Act for board members to communicate with each other over social media, even if it's a public setting like a chat room that everybody can access. This is one of the areas of bargaining. This is where board members say, if we conducted our discussion entirely in public posts on a chat room that's on the district website, isn't that better than a public meeting? Isn't that better than being in a room where the public doesn't bother to show up? Because our deliberations are all out there in public. They will see what we are thinking, and they can comment and give input, and it's so much better than holding a public meeting at 7 o'clock on a weekday night when most people want to be home with their families. And that's true, but it's also not compliant with the Brown Act. So social media, bulletin boards, chat rooms are subject to the exact same rules, which means that if there's a very difficult public matter within the board's jurisdiction, and someone goes and posts on a town council bulletin board or even a comment post to a local newspaper's website and says, I'm planning on voting no on this item because here are all my reasons. If another board member comments in response to that, and then a third responds, there's been a technical violation of the Brown Act. I think I can probably save the situation by saying that the first two people to post didn't intend to create a chain communication. They were hoping that the other board members would not comment, and they couldn't have stopped them even if they wanted to. But don't be the third guy. Don't be the third person to post in a public forum on a matter of public business, because the public expects that the only discussion amongst you will take place here, where they can see it.
Well, in essence, wouldn't that, even if a third person doesn't post, it's like
same
already
thing.
violated because the
You've read it.
the third, fourth, and fifth people
Can
have
read
probably
it.
all read it.
Yes, although it's hard to establish that.
Well, I realize you can't necessarily prove it, but you violated the
Yes,
spirit of it.
I'm most concerned about a situation where if the post is made, it's terribly hard to argue that it was unintentional or, I stumbled across it the minute I saw that two other of my colleagues had already posted. I closed the web browser and walked away from the computer.
Yeah, right.
Set it on fire and
Yeah,
all that. Now, another area of chain communication that can be sometimes difficult is that you're not allowed to use members of staff to be intermediaries to convey messages to each other offline. So you can't have the superintendent say, I want you to tell this member of the board that I'm never going to vote yes on the following item. And the superintendent knows this and won't carry that message. But other members of staff might not know that. As you go down in the organization, people might feel a necessity to do what you've asked, and that can create a difficult situation. They're not going to jail, you are, because Brown Act violations are committed by publicly elected board members. And if they were simply doing what they were told, it's a difficult situation for them, but it's your duty not to use them in that way. However, individual members of the public, when they meet with you to tell you what they would like you to do with the power that they have given you, don't violate the Brown Act, and they can't violate the Brown Act even if they purport to tell you how the other board members are voting. So if somebody were doing a good deal of politicking about some significant matter before your board and came and met with each one of you individually, it's not a serial meeting.
Right.
Because individual members of the public are allowed to lobby their elected officials however they see fit. And even if in each of those meetings they say, I have 4 other votes on the board, they're all voting yes on my item and I would like you to vote yes too, you might say, la 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 la, I didn't want to hear that, that's a Brown Act violation. It's not unless one of you tells that person to carry that message. So using a member of the public as an intermediary to convey messages to each other is also a no-no. Okay.
So what you're saying, it was okay, but it's a no-no.
It's okay for them to tell you, it's bad for you to ask them to tell you, or to ask them to carry the message for you.
But isn't that also hard to determine if it really happened? Because someone could say to a member of the public, go talk to the rest of the board and let me know what they said. So it still happens.
Yes, it
Right?
does, and I would just like the strongest possible
Don't do it.
ability to say, I met with that member of the public and I said how it was I intended to vote, and I told them, I said nothing about whether to tell my colleagues about it.
Would it be a better venue that board members or council people, whoever it is, would shy from letting someone know what their vote is going to be so there isn't anything that happens later? Because sometimes you could say yes today and then
Yes.
just change your mind when you get more information, but they've already told someone else.
Yes. So that's less a matter of Brown Act compliance, but it's a great issue of good governance.
Right.
I know there are, you have to get elected.
Yeah.
And you have to say what it is that you intend to do with the power that the voters give you when they elect you. So you can say, this is what I believe, and this is how I generally feel about these things. And it's within any board member's prerogative to be the type of politician who says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to vote this way. I think the longer you spend in public office, the more you realize that that's all bad news for you to
That's right.
tell a constituent how you're going to vote in advance, because what if you're convinced by your other colleagues who are voting the other way?
Yeah.
And what if you find out that they have an argument that you hadn't thought of that convinces you? It looks like you broke a promise to the person to whom you made that promise, even though there's a much more plausible and better explanation. So it's kind of a balance between saying, this I believe, and sticking with it, versus saying, I intend to hear what my colleagues say in a public meeting, and you will know what I think when I cast my vote. And it's
Or
up to
I'll
you
do
to
the
decide.
best I can.
Yes, exactly. It's up to you to decide where that balance lies.
Thank you. I just
Okay,
wanna make sure.
last item is teleconferences. This is another area where you would think that in today's day and age, we would have better legal technology to allow remote appearances at school board meetings, but the Brown Act makes it very difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. Very generally, not a question that's been asked by your district recently that I can recall, but you are allowed to have a remote location from which you call in so long as a majority of you are here. So if somebody's on vacation and wants to call in, they may. There are technical rules about what their phone has to be capable of doing. There are technical rules about posting an agenda in the remote location, and there are technical rules about that remote location being accessible to the public within the meaning of the Brown Act. If you're in your hotel room in Maui, that's fine, so long as you put the agenda outside and at the beginning of the meeting, leave the door propped open in case some member of the public wants to attend. They have that right to be there. You can't exclude them and say, get out of my hotel room, I'm on vacation. You're holding a meeting and you're in a remote location. The single biggest question from school board members that we get on teleconferences is, I have to leave to get to Tahoe. It's always Tahoe. I have to leave to get to Tahoe. There's a school board meeting on Friday night. I'm leaving, and I'll be on the road. I'll be on Highway 80, probably somewhere in Rockland at the moment that the vote is to be cast. And can I call in? And our answer has always been, sadly, no.
No.
Because you can't be in a car and say that your car is accessible to the public.
That's right.
And
Or
are we
you're not supposed to be on the
literally,
phone while you're driving anyway.
What about a cruise
actually,
ship?
the agenda posted on the, passenger side window.
What about a cruise ship?
Wait, I missed this. Say it
I,
again.
basically, a situation that I was in. I was on a cruise ship, but I wanted to call in. I
Yeah.
wanted to be part of it.
No, because this keeps moving.
Oh, boy. Well, if the agenda got posted after the ship set sail, I'd have a problem with it, because the public couldn't have gotten on that boat in time to accompany you. Generally speaking, it winds up being such a huge pain that most people say, I'm just going to skip, my absence isn't going to count toward the quorum. It's what most people wind up saying from a practical perspective. But there is a very narrow window of opportunity to hold a teleconference. Okay, I'm a little behind time, and it looks like I am going to wind up taking the full 90 minutes.
Oh, it's okay, this is good. This is
Okay, good. Item 3, what are the notice and agenda requirements? I'm pleased to say this is generally a matter for staff to be concerned about. Staff knows how to post an agenda, knows when to post an agenda, knows where to post an agenda, and you can rely on them to do that. But in general, this is the reason why, even if something's really important, if it's not on the agenda, you have to say, we can't take action on it, for the most part. There are 3 exceptions to those agenda requirements. The first is a finding of an emergency. But an emergency is a pretty narrow category. It kind of has to be some kind of calamity, like one of your schools caught fire and you need to have a meeting. And there are rules about how you have an emergency meeting on less than 72 hours' notice. There's also a need for immediate action arising after publication of the agenda. And that requires a 2/3 vote, or if there are less than 2/3 of you in the meeting, 100% of the people voting in favor of adding it to the agenda. And there are constraints on whether or not there's a need for an immediate action that arose after the publication of the agenda. It can't be, we forgot. It can't be, we knew about this, but it didn't make it onto the agenda, and now we think we need to add it. And there's also a rule for if it's been posted on a previous agenda and it's sort of carried over on a meeting set less than 5 days in the future. So you can actually continue a board meeting, but it's a very rarely used procedure. Every agenda has to contain an opportunity for public comment. That can take one of 2 forms. For a regular meeting of your board, it has to be a separate agenda item that says, public comment is invited here. If it's a special meeting, you have to allow members of the public to address you on the topic of the special meeting. So the distinction drawn here is, at a regular meeting of the school board, the one that you hold every 2 weeks or every month in the summer, whatever the case may be, a person could stand up and talk to you about anything that they think is important to the conduct of the school district's business, whether it's on the agenda or not. And then typically, what most public agencies do, and this is sort of the gold standard, it's the way the Board of Supervisors does it, is they say, public comment is if you want to talk about something that's not on the agenda. If you would like to address us on a matter that is on the agenda, you can come take the podium when we call that particular item. It's not illegal for you to say, public comment is anybody who wants to talk to us, and then you're kind of jumping all over the place in terms of topics. Most agencies find it more helpful to say, public comment is when somebody wants to get up and say, there's going to be a fundraiser at such and such school, and I invite you all to attend, and I would like all the members of the public to attend, and then they sit down, and then the agenda items are called individually, and if a person wants to speak on it, they get up and talk then. That's typically how it's done. The board president has the power to require that speakers only address matters that are within the school district's jurisdiction. If a person wants to talk to you about what the city council is doing and how they're doing it all wrong, you can say, that's not within our jurisdiction and I'm going to ask you to sit down. They don't have a right to use your forum to talk about things that aren't relevant to the district's business. So if a person wants to promote their business and stand up at the podium and say, I'd like everybody to come down to Rod's record shop, you can tell them to sit down. It's not relevant to the board's business. But it has to be conceivably within the board's jurisdiction. When a member of the public addresses you about a subject that's not on the agenda, there's a temptation to say, well, if you raised it, let's talk about it. Brown Act doesn't allow that. Board members are at most allowed to briefly respond to matters in public comment not on the agenda, and that is to provide information to the public, to ask for clarification from district staff, to direct staff to research and report on the matter at a future meeting, or to instruct staff to schedule the matter for a discussion at a future public meeting. So that's kind of the best practices for how to deal with it. If a person says, I've got a very significant issue and it's terrible what's happening to my kid and you need to do something about it, that you turn to the superintendent and say, I ask you to put this on the agenda for the next meeting. Because then you're responding in the only way you can, and you can explain, we can't take action on it tonight. What we can do is direct that it be agendized for a public meeting. And typically there's a request that the superintendent look into the matter so that you're advised by some kind of staff report.
If I may, just to follow up on the ability to briefly comment, what if there was a hot topic issue, say, for example, it's supervisors, and then we say there's a racism issue, and then it's public comment, and someone talks about racism. How far, and it doesn't have to be a subject, let's just say, I don't know, it's the county fair, let's say
Right.
county fair issue. How much, or what is the constraints that an elected official can respond to that? When you talk about brief, when you talk about this.
Right.
Because it's not so much that you cannot say anything, but you're constrained to what you can say. Can you give us an example of something like that?
Sure.
Say the county fair.
I would prefer that briefly respond means to say really nothing more than that issue is of very significant importance to me and I would like to see it discussed at a future board meeting. But not to take it as an opportunity to say, I'm outraged, something needs to be done. I want the superintendent to bring back a recommendation as follows at the next board meeting. The reason why is that it deprives the public that didn't know that the topic was going to be discussed from an opportunity to also address you, okay? So it's really for the protection of people that aren't in the room, because they should have a right to hear what you have to say as well, and it's not okay to use the fact that a member of the public has talked about something not on the agenda to say, oh, what a relief, I've been meaning to give a long speech about this for a long time, and now I'm going to do it. So it involves some restraint, but you can say, this illustrates why I think this is an important issue for us to discuss, so I would ask that it be on the very next agenda. And that's the best way to demonstrate that you're responding in a very productive way to the public. Special meetings can be called on 24 hours notice as opposed to 72 hours notice for a regular meeting. That's really a valuable tool for dealing with things that are urgent and need to be taken on right away. There's a new law that was enacted in response to the scandals in Southern California over the city of Bell. You may recall this was a city that had been driving itself into bankruptcy by giving all of its employees lavish raises and other perks. So now it's illegal to call a special meeting for the purpose of discussing the compensation of the public executive officers unless it's in the context of discussing the agency's budget. So if in the past you were going to hold a special meeting to discuss giving your senior staff raises, you have to do that at a regular meeting that's agendized as opposed to a 24-hour notice special meeting, except if you're holding a special study session on your budget and it's talked about in the context of the budget. I guess the idea is the public would know to show up if you're talking about the budget as opposed to kind of sneaking it in and giving everybody raises without somebody realizing it.
Can we talk about that? So, say for example, we're giving raises to superintendents and our senior staff. So it has to be a public, or it has to be an agendized item, but is that an open session meeting
Okay.
or a closed session meeting?
I was going to address that at a later, the second to last item is what closed sessions are permissible. Evaluation of your employees is a permissible closed session. And almost everyone does all of their evaluation of employees entirely in a closed session. You can talk about the merits of an employee in relation to their expectations and their past performance, et cetera, in a closed session. You can even come to a conclusion in a closed session that you would like to give your superintendent a raise. You can't do it in a closed session, though.
So we have in a superintendent's raise or assistant superintendent's or a principal's raise has to be a open session item.
Okay, there's a specific process that's followed by most school districts in this regard. If there is a proposal to change a particular term of a contracted employee's contract, just in the same way that you can negotiate your employment with your unionized members in a closed session and have a conference with your labor negotiator and sort of work out who's going to accept what, and we can't offer this much, but we'll offer this instead. That can happen in a closed session. You can also do that with individual employees. So if the superintendent says, I would like my senior staff to receive the following in terms of compensation, that can occur in a closed session. But the actual action to grant it has to happen in a particular way, usually with a ratification of contracts in open session. So you can't sign, well, you could technically sign a contract in closed session with an employee, but there's actually a section of the government code that says it's not effective until it's been ratified in an open session.
Okay.
That was legislation that was carried, I believe, by Senator Quentin Kopp.
Clinton Cobb, yes.
He actually, when he was in the Senate, introduced a bill that prevented the granting of employment contracts entirely in closed session.
Right.
You have to actually ratify it at an open meeting of the school board.
And those details are open to, since it's an open?
Yes.
So say for example,
Of the final terms of the
the final
contract.
term.
So you don't need to negotiate in public. It's bad for your negotiating position to have to do so. So this is one area where what some people would consider a loophole is actually just the legislature's determination that if you have to negotiate out in the open, you'll wind up losing 10 times out of 10. So you're allowed to negotiate in private. Tell your labor negotiator, we can't offer X, but we can offer Y, and you're allowed to do that. It's perfectly legal.
so since it has to be open session and details have to be disclosed in open session, then most senior staff in all school boards should have public data of what those compensation packages are.
Okay. This is where I'm at a disadvantage because I don't know the practice in your district. Some school employees at the district level have employment contracts. And there's a specified set of officials, and it generally is superintendent, assistant superintendent, chief business official, who can have employment contracts and be employed individually. Their contracts are a matter of public record, and they have to be acted upon in this way. Other senior
law.
by your board.
But also by law, it has, since.
That is a requirement of the law in the government code. Other senior staff members, if their salaries are set by a schedule, say your principals receive a set, you take action as to all of them as opposed to have individual contracts with each of them, you're going to be adopting that salary schedule in a public meeting. You don't need to take action as to each of them individually.
So if the district level contracts are not public information as by requested, as the bill written by Quentin Kopp, that's actually a violation of full disclosure.
Okay? The requirement of the law is that to be effective,
To be
the
effective.
action taken in closed session has to be ratified in an open session of the board.
Does the Ed Code Act, the Brown Act actually say ratify? Because I thought we were told, well, umpteen time ago, when he first made that change, was that we had to take we could agree that this is what we wanted, but that we had to take the action, and we never called it ratified. It was just the action to approve the contract, and the contract was actually signed with the amount of the pay in public, even though we already knew in closed session, this is what we wanted.
Right.
So is that actually, sounds like we're saying it's a done deal in closed session, and we're only ratifying, and I think that's when the public says,
Okay.
then why do it that way? So am I
I
correct?
think you're correct, but
Thank you.
the disconnect is that there's a section of the education code that says that no action of a school district is valid until it's ratified by the school board. So even if you did sign in closed session, it wouldn't be effective as of the signature. It would be effective as of the ratification. So as long as there is an action by the school board in open session, you can't break the law, even if you signed it beforehand. Because it
Okay.
would be.
Well, we were told not, that we don't call it ratification. That's why I'm confused hearing that now.
I don't have it's not in the Brown Act, it's a separate section of the government code.
Yeah.
My recollection is that it allows for ratification. But,
But it has to be done in public.
yeah, you see, right, it has, that portion has to be done in public.
Because that's actually already a done deal.
Uh-huh. Okay, so there
And
are.
one more question, I guess this is how it goes. So there is talks about how much salaries are. And what I'm trying to say is that by law, these contracts must be public information as ratified.
Yes.
Oh, they
Okay.
are?
Yes,
Okay, got it,
yes,
okay.
yes.
But
Yeah,
see,
I mean, right. That's an elaborate topic, but the conclusion is exactly that. Yeah.
'cause like even tonight, we approved an appointment, but
Right.
we put on the agenda the appointment and the salary and
Correct.
everything. So it's very transparent
That's
to
right.
the public. And that's
And-
what they want to see. They want to see it there.
I'll be quite honest with you, in today's day and age, nobody asks to see the employment contract, they just go to the Mercury News website and they look it up on the online database. Because then they're actually seeing the compensation that's actually being provided as opposed to whatever is in the contract. So, yeah, we're an open book. Everybody's an open book
Okay.
these days.
Well, that makes them happy, I
So
guess.
closed sessions are, there are special rules for how to agendize a closed session. There are safe harbor language that needs to be included in the agenda to make sure that you're allowing yourself the proper form of closed session. I won't go into too many details about what closed sessions are permissible because there's a long list, but I will say this. Early on in a school board member's career, they just trust if they're told, this is a closed session item, this is an open session item, and generally speaking, the superintendent is right 99% of the time about whether something can be in closed session or has to be an open session. Over the course of years, as people serve on school boards for a longer time, they start to ask the question, why can't we put this in closed session? Because they will begin to formulate the idea that closed sessions are an opportunity to discuss something behind closed doors, and if they can think of a good reason why something should be behind closed doors, there probably has to be a provision in the Brown Act for a closed session. That is not the case. You could have the best reason in the world for doing something in a closed session, but if it's not on the list, it's not going to be a closed session. There's no rule of reason or catch-all rule that says that if there are very compelling reasons to be in closed session, you can hold a closed session. No. It's only if it's on the list and it has to fall into one of those categories. It may be a case where the superintendent can work with us to find out whether or not one of those listed rules actually applies to what you're really going to be discussing, and we're happy to advise superintendents about how to get there if you can get there. But we can't make it happen because the board is convinced that it has to be in closed session. There's also a rule for reporting out action from closed session, but it's only a requirement that final action taken by the board is reportable as an action. If there's a preliminary action, or if that action is contingent upon the completion of some other thing, then you don't need to report it out of closed session, because the public is only entitled to know what you have done in conclusion of the closed session item, not preliminary steps. You have to convene in, you have to gather in an open session before going into a closed session, and then you have to come back out into open session and adjourn from an open session. So it sometimes involves a little awkwardness of, I think your closed sessions have both been here and sometimes other places, but sometimes it involves everybody sitting down, saying, let's approve the agenda, and then getting up and leaving, which can be awkward, but it is what the Brown Act actually requires. And then people come back out, sit down in their seats and say, in our closed session, we did the following final actions, and is there a motion to adjourn? We're adjourned. Notices and agendas, including closed session items, have to be provided in a certain number of formats available, generally speaking, to the public at the meeting. And then now there's a requirement that it also be on the district's website if it has one. I'm pleased to say, I think you guys subscribe to Agenda Online through CSBA, and that is compliant. So you're all good on that.
I'm curious about what about the backup material?
So there is something called the agenda packet.
Right.
The agenda packet is essentially part of the agenda. And if it's provided to the board, it must be made available to the public at the same time. And if it's given to less than 100% of the board, it has to be given to the public when it reaches a majority of you. So if it's click send on the email and it goes out to 5 of you, it better be posted on the website at the same time. This was a change in the law from about 5 years ago because too many public agencies were getting sloppy and sending out their board packets to people and then waiting until the day of the meeting, and then the public would see the packet sitting there and they'd be leafing through it trying to figure out what the board had already spent 72 hours reviewing and deciding.
Yeah. So if they have a website and the agenda is online, that full packet must be online?
Yeah, if you are getting it, then the public should also get it. If it's for an open session item, closed session items, if it's like a report of a conference with a teacher over a discipline matter or something like that, that wouldn't necessarily go to the public.
So, just out of curiosity, so if someone was basically an outside vendor was coming in with a presentation, their packet must be, whatever they give us and whatever we display must be given out to the public 72 hours. So say, for example, Chevron Energy Services comes out with a packet, gives it to us, but doesn't have a copy online or for members of the public. That's a violation.
It would be the duty of the school district to figure out a way to post it online before giving it to you.
And
So what has happened is that the board gets information or packets at the board meeting, and there are generally extra packets for members of the public here. And so,
but if it's not available online,
so sometimes
so we get it here. So basically, 100% gets it here, but the public doesn't get it.
What's not allowed is to give it to you, but not to give it to the public. So if you get it at the same time as the public, it's compliant. And this is only.
But if we get it and the public doesn't get it,
it has to be, the public has to be given some access to it somehow.
but if they don't,
But if they don't, it's a problem.
But if we hold back material and give it to us just here, so we can just say, well, same time we give it to you, members of the public that may have looked at it online and said, wow, I better go to that meeting, won't have that opportunity to have looked at it to know they should be here.
Right, it's
So I
supposed to.
think you've got to be careful that we don't just automatically say, because I personally, as a board member, do not like getting material at the meeting here when I'm trying to listen and trying to see what's here, and it looks like I'm not prepared, and I'm not.
yeah, let's be honest. Like,
So let's
if we
face
get
it,
we're
this-
looking at just like you haven't given us the notes yet. So as we pay more attention to you, as we get those packets and they're given and people are talking to us,
We can't read it.
flipping through it.
So I think we probably would be well that if we tried our best to get material ahead of time and let the public see it, let us see it, or they come back to us later, wow, I saw it after the meeting, and wow, I didn't get a chance to speak on it. So I just think,
That's where, excuse me, so we do try to make the agenda item as specific as possible.
Yeah.
It's not, there are many agencies who are very general in their agenda items, and we really work hard to make the agenda item specific so members of the public know what the agenda item is. There's also great effort put into providing background, more information on what the agenda item is to be acted on. Sometimes it's not possible to get the material posted online or to the board until sometimes even 24 hours in advance, but at the moment that the board gets it, it's made available to the public. When the board gets it here, it's made available to the public that is present here. And oftentimes, I can't say for sure always, but oftentimes that is later added to the board agenda as a packet. So any PowerPoint presentations and those kinds of things that board members received at the time here, made available to the public, is also posted, attached to the agenda item so that members can.
I guess my concern is the fact that if we don't get them, it's something like a vendor that gets a $13 million contract. We don't have time to look over the numbers, and we're bombarded at that time. We're not prepared. And if I were a taxpayer and I would have the time to look over those numbers, and if I were a vendor that would get $13 million, I would take 72 hours at least to prepare something for submission. But now that I understand it's a violation of a Brown Act, if I do get something in less time, that could be a
No,
concern.
I'm not saying that.
No.
What I'm saying is, it's a violation to give it to the board and not to the public.
Right.
There's not a requirement that it be given to the board 72 hours in advance of the meeting. So it's not a violation of the Brown Act for you to be given a stack of documents at the beginning of the meeting. It may be a problem for you, you may not want it to happen, and you may direct the superintendent not to do that, but it's not a violation of the Brown Act.
Right.
This is simply a matter of public access to the same stuff that you're seeing. If you're getting it late and the public's getting it late, the Brown Act doesn't regard that as a problem.
Right.
So let's turn to what are the public's rights. This is an overlap to a bit of what we've been talking about already. Generally, they have a right to access your meetings and to view your deliberations. So access means the right to be notified of items to be considered, and that's done by compliance with the agenda requirements, to attend meetings of legislative bodies without identifying themselves if they choose. So you can't have a policy that prohibits somebody from being in the room if they won't say who they are. To record the meeting if they wish, so long as their recording mechanism does not present a disruption, like if they set up the camera right here, pointing at all of you, and it blocked the view of the public. To have access to documents that are distributed to members of the legislative body that we just talked about a moment ago. Not to pay for the agency's costs in complying with the Brown Act. You can't charge a fee to attend the meetings to cover your compliance costs.
Would repeat that one more time?
You couldn't charge a fee to attend a meeting.
Oh, yeah,
Sell
okay.
tickets to board meetings.
Gosh,
And,
darn.
The packet costs $10 to reproduce.
yeah, and to be free from discrimination is the last requirement of the Brown Act. That generally means you have to hold your meetings in a disability accessible structure and some other things. You can always choose to provide greater access to the public and greater rights to the public than the Brown Act requires, but these are the minimum requirements. The location of regular and special meetings are supposed to be within the boundaries of the jurisdiction. There are a small number of exceptions, generally relating to conducting job interviews of potential candidates outside the jurisdiction, but you could have a board retreat in Costa Mesa. That would be a violation of the Brown Act. You're holding a meeting outside the jurisdiction. That's not good. There's a right of the public to have the votes taken or reported in open session. Secret ballots are expressly prohibited, both in open session and in closed session. The public has a right to know how each one of you voted on every single item. If something's unanimous, you can simply say, we voted unanimously. But if you're reporting an action in closed session and it was a 4-1 split, you have to report that it was a 4-1 split and then say, trustee A dissented, or trustee A voting no. Then the public knows, okay, these 4 voted yes, this one voted no. That's their right to know how each person voted, even on closed session
We
items.
haven't done that.